Welcome back to the Shepherd's Heart. I hope you've been with us up to this point in the season. We have with us a new guy, Muddle Ballaston.
Yes.
Well, maybe new to you all, but Muddle and I go back at least 25 years.
Yes.
We're very close too. We met when I was still in college. I don't think I was married yet. If I was, it was right about that time. So that puts us back around 1987 or so. Dating myself. Last episode, we talked about somewhat of a controversial topic. Is it okay to have a congregation that's ethnically/culturally monogamous? I don't know, heterogeneous or
Homogeneous.
Homogeneous, thank you.
Is the phrase.
Monogamous. I kind of like that. A congregation that's monogamous. So I, as I said before, I didn't want to just hit easy topics. I wanted to hit kind of controversial topics. And so I've got another one.
Okay.
And I want to couch it in an argument that I heard. You Jewish people who believe in Jesus, you're legalistic in trying to keep these Jewish holidays. Not only that, but you're pushing your legalism on Christians, trying to tell them to keep Passover and stuff like that. What do you think about this whole concept of, one, non-Jews, Christians, observing Jewish traditions, and two, kind of being forceful with people keeping Jewish traditions?
If you'll allow me, I think there are two questions that need to be, that this thing needs to be broken down into. Number one, it is undeniable that our faith in Yeshua, in Jesus as Messiah, has Jewish roots. I mean, everyone out there watching has grandparents. You can deny your grandparents, you may not like your grandparents, but they are your grandparents. So it is a useless exercise to deny that our Christian faith has completely strong Jewish roots. If there had not been a Judaism, there would not be a Christianity. If there had not been a Hanukkah, there would not be a Christmas. These are simple facts of history. And yet you will find some people who are so anti-Jewish that those simple facts make them argumentative.
Yeah.
I mean, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. History is history, and the Jewish roots are all there. Anyone who's done an honest survey of the New Testament understands the New Testament takes place in the context of a Jewish community, of a Jewish town, of a Jewish family, and of a Jewish Messiah presenting himself first to the Jewish community and then to the outer world saying, I am the Messiah that you have long expected. So the Jewish roots of the faith are undeniable. Now, the second question is, to what extent should believers practice those Jewish roots, practice Jewish culture, observe Old Testament holy days? That's a real question on which I believe that there can be several valid responses depending on the type of ministry that God has called you to.
So this kind of harkens back to a previous conversation when we were in Romans chapter 14. We talked about sometimes people are entitled to their personal preferences. There's neither right nor wrong. It's personal. And we're supposed to grant one another license and liberty to have those personal preferences. So you're saying it's the same thing with, for example, Passover? If First Baptist Church wants to do a Passover Seder, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if Second Baptist doesn't want to, that's not necessarily a bad thing either?
We have freedom. Obviously, as the Romans 14 passage indicates, we do have freedom in these things. In another episode, we were talking about the 1 Corinthians 9, verse 20 passage. To the Jew, as I became as a Jew. Literally, the word there is Judean. Not as because Paul was a Jew. He couldn't become a Jew, but he wasn't a Judean. He was a Jew from the diaspora, and so he didn't dress the Judean way. So he had to actually put on their culture that he might win the Judeans. And so the real question is it simply an evangelistic strategy, or is this something that will enrich the lives of all believers? And my simple response would be that all believers, regardless of their ethnic or cultural background, regardless of the language they speak, will become enriched by understanding the Jewish roots of their faith, and to maybe one extent or another extent, participating and embracing the Jewish roots of the faith. It doesn't mean you're going to change your doctrine. It doesn't mean you're going to change the building. You don't need to start putting up Israeli flags. But to go through the Passover Resurrection Sunday season with blindness to the whole context in which Resurrection Sunday took place, which was the Passover context, well, you're still going to be saved. You can still lead the choir, but you're going to miss so much of what's going on in the narrative of the book that you claim to believe.
So from your perspective, it's not a matter of must or must not. It's a matter of being more blessed. Maybe even blessed isn't right the word. More edified, perhaps, is a better word.
We're told to take in God's word. And when we say, well, it's like you go along to the buffet, well, I like this, I don't like that, because that's poison, so I'm only going to eat this. Well, no, God has spread out a buffet in front of all of us. It's all good as long as it's all Bible. And it's not, you can't just say, well, I like, the book of Romans, but I don't like the book of Leviticus because, all those rules and regulations. Well, I understand that. No one's asking you to obey all those rules and regulations because we're no longer under Mosaic law. But those rules and regulations, nevertheless, were the context in which all the apostles lived. So if you ignore that, you will still be saved, but you will be walking around with only a partial knowledge.
All right, well, let me ask you a related question. This goes to both of you. I don't know if it's an issue in your congregation or not, Umberto, but I've seen it in a lot of white evangelical congregations where somebody in the congregation, just some family, gets all into Jewish roots. And the next thing you know, they're causing dissent in their congregation. They're pestering the pastor to no end. We got to do this. We got to do this. You're not in God's will. And they're telling people about it, not in a positive way, even though it's a positive thing. In a negative way, causing disruption. What do you say to that sort of thing? And have you experienced it?
Well, before I go into that, I think a good way to describe, I think, what Montel was talking about has to do like if I was to marry, for example, a Jewish woman or some other culture, some other people, they could get to know my family or my background just simply by getting together once a year at certain little holidays or something. And so they would have kind of a knowledge about who I am and where I come from. But really, if they really want to know who I am, and they really want to know what made me who I am and what I really value, then I think that they would want to dig into that culture. They would really want to eat with that family. They would want to spend time with them, and then they would really know who I am and why I am who I am and all of these things. So again, if we are to understand who Christ is, Jesus Christ is, if we are to understand who the disciples were, who Paul and Peter were, we need to delve deep into all of these things, because without that, we really don't have the correct, full view of who Christ the Messiah is. In a certain sense, we've made Christ the Messiah Mexican, Italian, or German, and so we're really missing out on the fullness of who he is. And so again, I think this is very important to, again, begin to understand the necessity of learning these things, delving into these things, because these were important to Jesus Christ. That's who he was. That's how he lived. And when he returns, he's going to return in that way.
So if you love Yeshua, you'd want to know him better.
I believe so.
And if you want to know him better, you'd want to know about his family and his culture.
Exactly. But again, what is required, I think it's very telling, like of Ruth. I really love the statement of Ruth when she makes her commitment to her mother-in-law. Your people will be my people. Wherever you die, I'm going to die. I will be buried where you are buried. I mean, that is a big commitment to her culture, to her people, to all of this thing. And I believe, again, that woman, of course, is an expression of Gentile nations, and Naomi is an expression of the Jewish people. And so I believe we need to make some type of commitment like that in order for us truly to have very good depth in understanding really who is Jesus, who is the Lord Jesus Christ.
All right. Lotto, what are your thoughts?
I really appreciate Umberto's statement about that, because we all value our own personal culture, our families, but at the same time, the facts of the New Testament say that Jesus was born in this particularly Jewish way. So I think that this should be something that every believer, no matter what ministry God has called them to, every believer should be interested in this. It doesn't need to dominate, certainly, but it will enrich and inform the rest of what we do in Scripture. So it shouldn't overshadow, and I really appreciate what you said. Never, ever should it become the basis for dissension, the basis for being divisive, for saying, well, I'm better because I do Passover and you don't. That's a silly sort of thing. It will enrich congregations. And just very simply, I have seen, standard evangelical Baptist pastors, of whom many I count as friends. They were initially concerned about the Jewish roots.
Yeah.
But then when they recognized that it posed no threat, were able to incorporate some of these things. Yeah. And so I have a dozen or so Baptist pastor friends who now, when they officiate communion, typically on the first Sunday of the month, it's a typical Baptist way to do it, and I say that with affection, they will now, there's no Jewish person present. I'm not there. But by their own report to me, they've started to incorporate some of the background of communion, which, of course, it was the last Passover supper of Jesus. And they start to remind people that this was a Passover meal, that just as the people had gotten redemption from the threat in ancient Egypt by the blood of a Passover lamb, so it is today that as believers we are redeemed by the blood of the greater Passover lamb, Jesus the Messiah.
To be able to learn something about the Seder, to be able to learn, the full context of it, like, it's just wonderful to me. Like you're reading out of the New Testament, and it reads, after the supper, it says they sang the hymn, yeah. And we go through and they sang the hymn, and we think, well, what did they sing? Amazing Grace. What did they sing? But you don't have no concept about what it's talking about unless you understand the Seder. You understand that they've always sang the same hymn, and at the end they sing the same hymn. If you don't understand that, you're missing out on a lot of things. You're just missing out. And then when you find out what it was that he was singing about, that he was going to be rejected, he was that rock that was rejected. When you hear all that, it just brings a lot of depth. It just brings a lot of color, a lot of fullness into what you already know. And it just makes you, in my opinion, stronger in Christ, because you see the fulfillment of prophecy. You see God in everything that was going on, no accident, nothing, preordained, predestined, everything. And I think it just strengthens your faith. That's what we're looking for. It's not about being better than thou. It's about drawing closer to Christ, who Christ is.
And I think you'd both agree with me. I know you well enough to say so, but if you don't, by all means, feel free to argue.
I'll feel free.
Yeah, I know you will. This idea, we share our culture,
yes,
Jesus' culture with Gentiles. Yeah. We're honored and pleased when non-Jews want to do Passover
Sure.
and learn about our holidays and our traditions, but we don't feel compelled or that it's even right that they should feel like they need to become Jewish.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to be aware, to even learn and practice. 1 Corinthians says this, was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Mm-hmm. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. And the preceding verse says, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned him, to which God called him. Yeah. There are Jews, there are Gentiles. God made Jews to be Jews and Gentiles to be Gentiles.
Steve, can you give the address of that so that people can look at that verse for themselves?
1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 17 and 18. And there's more in the context. It goes on. 19, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each one should remain in the situation which he was when God called him. So I think it's great when Gentile people come to our Passover Seder. Mm-hmm. I think it's great that most of our Messianic congregation is filled with Gentile people, because most of Tucson is filled with Gentile people.
There you go. It reflects the community.
It reflects the community. If we were 90% Jewish, we'd have a problem.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But when Gentile people start feeling like they must be Jewish, or they feel bad that they're not Jewish.
Yeah.
That's
Oh, my
that's
goodness.
a problem.
That is really the issue. For almost 17 years, I served as either a Messianic rabbi or associate rabbi, and it broke my heart when I'd have Gentile believers come in lying and trying to deceive and pretending to be Jewish, looking for a congregation to join. Listen, I've been around the block. I grew up in Jewish communities. It was quickly obvious to almost everyone in the room the person was not Jewish. So many things just betray it.
Yeah.
And here's the heartbreak. God did not make a mistake when that person was born into an Irish family.
Amen.
God did not make a mistake when that person was born into a Latino or a Filipino community. There needs to be an embrace by each believer of what this passage is saying. If we were called in a certain way, we need to then use that to reach that community. And for people, and it's a dishonest thing. And it really, the rest of the mainstream Jewish community looks at it as being intentionally deceptive. You're pretending to be Jewish. And sadly, right now, in the Messianic movement, there are probably several hundred individuals who are active in the movement who say they are Jewish, but actually have zero Jewish ethnic background. They have misunderstood the fact that in Messiah we are all equally beloved. We are all equally accepted, and we truly are brothers and sisters. One of the greatest blessings I've ever had is when I have Gentile believers stand up and say, I am a Gentile. I don't pretend to be Jewish, but here's why I love the Jewish people. And I have several friends who have ministries who clearly say, I'm Gentile, but here's why we need to love the Jewish people. They're not Jew wannabes. They're not trying to pass, but they're recognizing that God did not make a mistake when they were born, and that they have a mission, and that mission is to make the wider church aware of the Jewish roots of their faith.
Even though we are Jewish-oriented in our culture and conversation here, we don't believe that Jews are closer to God.
That's right.
More saintly. There's no second-class saints.
There's no second-class children.
Right.
God has no second-class children. He doesn't prefer one group over the other. And I've said this from the pulpit in our congregation so many times, that if you're here, you are a full member of the congregation. We have no tiers of membership. No. And it is a foreign idea to the New Testament narrative. It was one congregation. One of the things that I was blessed by seeing was during the time that my wife and I were living in Jerusalem, renting an apartment there, studying Hebrew, we were attending a Messianic congregation whose services are in Hebrew, although there's an earpiece you can wear in English. And I was very proud of the fact that when we first started attending, I needed to wear the earpiece. But by the end of 3 months there and all of the Hebrew intensive Hebrew Ulpan studies we were doing, I didn't need the earpiece after 3 months.
Wow.
So that was a blessing. But here's the thing. You had in this congregation about 7 elders. It was an elder-led congregation. Of the 7 elders, there were a mix of Jewish elders, there was a Gentile fellow from North America, and there was an Arab believer there from Jerusalem. It was a wonderful testimony. Now, of course, the congregation is a Messianic congregation. Everyone there who's not Jewish understands that when they embrace that culture, the congregation is Jewish. In Jerusalem, they had a choice. There were other good evangelical congregations. There's a congregation there, you'd walk in and think you're in Memphis, Tennessee. It's in middle of Jerusalem, but it's very contemporary. It looks like a lot of charismatic services today in America. All the lights, and it's very well produced. But that's their choice, and there should be one place in the
I'd
land
probably
of
go to
Israel.
that one.
In the land- and that's fine. For some people, they would prefer that. We wanted a blend. And again, everyone understood that they were valued there. They were a valued member of the family. There were no preferences. But God gives us these options.
There's this salvation cycle that's referenced in Romans. It says the message came to the Jewish people so that they might bring it to the Gentile people. But the Jewish people stumbled in their faith, so
Yes.
the message was taken up by the Gentiles so that they might bring it back to the Jewish people. It's a wheel.
Yeah.
And if any part of that wheel is flat, the whole wheel's flat. You know? Oh, it's only flat at the bottom.
No,
Remind-
it really does affect how a church sees itself if it has a rounded wheel and is able to embrace all that is there in the New Testament without segregating, well, we don't do this because this is too Jewish or people wouldn't understand that. Again, as I've seen from many of my conservative evangelical pastor friends, they have embraced the Jewish roots of the faith. They incorporate it, whether I'm there or not there.
Yeah.
Obviously, when the Jewish guy is there and I'm speaking, people will, they know I'm coming for several weeks, so they do certain music.
Right.
They want to make the service sound more Jewish. I appreciate that. But how wonderful it would be if they did that when I'm not there. Even better. Nach besser, as we say in Yiddish. And so more and more pastors are incorporating the Jewish roots of the faith into their everyday Sunday practice, and it's enriching the congregation because the congregation recognizes, Pastor Bob didn't invent this religion 30 years ago, but we have rich roots that go all the way down into Old Testament soil. So, First Evangelical Church is not some fly-by-night 30-year-old organization, but our faith is based on the Old Testament.
Yeah.
This idea of Jewish culture, I don't have a problem with people taking a sense of pride in it, but the idea of taking a sense of superiority
Oh, yes.
and belittling
Oh, my
other
goodness.
congregations
Oh, my goodness.
and speaking down to them, we see it a lot.
Yes.
What would you recommend we do to help people be a little more spiritually balanced in this area?
The whole, I am grieved when I see people in my own Messianic movement diss and just put down, for instance, Sunday congregations. That's a big thing in certain parts of the Messianic movement. If you meet on Sunday, they'll say, well, that's a pagan practice. What they don't understand is in the Romans 14 passage that we had read earlier, one man observes one day, another man observes a different day, it says in Romans 14. Let everyone be convinced in their own mind. That automatically disqualifies you from being judgmental toward other congregations which have a different practice. Here's the ultimate question, and I believe everyone would agree. The ultimate question is, are people becoming more like the Messiah?
Amen.
We're not there to play synagogue.
Yeah.
We're not there to play church. We're there to be more like Jesus.
I do tell people, you're right, Sunday's not the Sabbath, and that's not the issue.
That's correct.
I said, answer this question for me. Which day of the week is it inappropriate to worship God?
Yes.
Because you're telling me that it's not appropriate to worship God on Sunday.
Yeah, one thing is to recognize what is the Sabbath day, and then another thing is to recognize what day do we worship.
Yep.
Yes.
Two
Yes.
separate.
One thing is to recognize what God established as the Sabbath, and to recognize. But the other thing is to recognize you can worship God. Those are two separate issues.
And there are some Christian sects that actually teach that if you worship God on Sunday, it's paganism.
Yeah.
It's sinful. And it blows my mind. How can worshiping God ever be sinful? If I'm in a well upside down on my head, I'm worshiping God. Is that a bad thing, So we've only got a couple minutes left. Umberto, let me get personal with you now.
Uh-oh.
I know, scary. Have you been introducing Jewish stuff to your church?
Yes.
And how's that going over?
It's going very well because I'm doing it very slowly and methodically as people are able to absorb it. You know, it's kind of like as you're marching down, you know, we're marching down somewhere, you know, you're going to have babies, you're going to have grandpas, grandmas, you're going to have young, strong people. Of course, those strong people, they want to run into it and
Yeah.
get there quickly, and they want to ignore grandpa, they want to ignore the babies. But as a leader, you know, you got to take into account grandpas and grandmas and babies. So again, you got to go at the correct pace, and not everybody's at the right place. And so we're trying to go at something in the pace that God is revealing and God is bringing conviction to. Then we're taking in that pace, but we're not going to jump into something that we're not ready, or we don't think the congregation is yet ready. So we're taking it very slowly.
Muddle used a buffet illustration previously. It might have been on a previous episode. And it's all good if it's all Bible, you said.
Yeah.
And I see what you're doing is something similar. You're making the food available, but you're not force-feeding anybody.
Yeah, because there's certain subjects, you know, that might interest me that might not interest others. Montel was talking about the Jewish or Sephardic, you know, Spanish people, and that's been introduced to us, that knowledge. And so I've studied up into that thing, and so I've discovered certain things. So that interests me particularly. But I'm not going to push that on the congregation because it might not interest a lot of them. So I do that in my personal thing. And if somebody's interested, they can come to me and I can talk to them personally about it. But it's not going to be something I'm going to be speaking Sunday after Sunday at the church because that's my personal thing.
Absolutely.
Somebody
And it would make them uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Hey, speaking of Sephardic and Ladino, we've been for the last few years during the Hanukkah season singing a song in Ladino.
Ocho Candelicas.
Yes, Ocho Candelicas.
Yes, yes.
So if you're interested in it, maybe off camera I can, you know, hook you up with our worship leader. I'm not singing it. I don't even know it, but our worship team does it, and that might be something you'd be interested in.
My wife is fully Sephardic, and she really loves that song.
When I first heard it, I thought it was in Spanish.
Right.
I didn't even know. And so I sent it to somebody in our worship team who's fluent in Spanish. She's Hispanic. She said, "This isn't Spanish. It's Ladino." Oh, okay. Ocho Candelicas.
Yes.
Who knew?
Candles.
Yes, 8 candles for Hanukkah, of course.
Yeah.
All right, well, this is the Shepherd's Heart. This is what you see. This is what you get. We look forward to seeing you on the other side of the break for some more.
GLC invites you to visit us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/GLCTV. Here you can stay in touch with all of the latest GLC news along with daily scriptural inspirations, current specials in our bookstore, links to our newest shows, and online media, plus articles from trusted sources. Feel free to drop us a message or a question by posting to our page. Please help us out and like our page by clicking on the thumbs up button. Don't delay, drop by the GLC Facebook page at facebook.com/GLCTV. We want to interact with you today.
Welcome back to the Shepherd's Heart. On the other side of the break, we were talking about Jewish roots and what's appropriate and inappropriate in sharing, expressing, and practicing in our diverse believing community. It was a nice little conversation. We're going to get a little more practical even.
Oh, my goodness.
We're right now in a very comical, dramatic,
Messy.
difficult, messy, political season.
I thought it was a circus.
There's the comical part.
Yes.
I have refrained personally for the last several years of saying anything this time of year about candidates for a couple reasons. One, if you have a nonprofit organization, the government doesn't allow you to endorse candidates, and it can get you in all sorts of trouble as a pastor.
Sure.
But two, and even more importantly to me, I want to reach people who may not be where I am. And if I get all crazy about a candidate, I might alienate half the people in town who don't support my candidate. My candidate's Yeshua. I want people to be into Yeshua. So what I do year after year is I tell people to vote biblical values.
Amen.
Whichever candidate supports the biblical values, those are the ones you should vote for. And sometimes I'll get even specific. I'll say, look at the big issues: abortion, homosexuality, things that the Bible clearly speaks about. What does your candidate say about those issues? Yeah. So we're going to talk about politics today in the believers from a pastor/rabbi's perspective.
Sure.
But just from a believer's perspective, what should our relationship be in our community with politics? What are your thoughts? Umberto, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I do believe we do have a responsibility to inform people. We do have a responsibility to speak about the necessity to be involved. You know, I think Jeremiah was the one that wrote a letter to those who were in exile in Babylon. And he told them that they needed to make their little garden. They needed to have their boys marry young girls and their girls married young men. And he told them to pray over that and to seek the peace or the welfare of that city wherever they were at. Because he said, in that peace, you're going to be blessed and you're going to have peace. And so I think the Jewish people have been very good about doing that in the dispersion, wherever they've been in Mexico and different places. It seems like they've gotten very good at doing that because they tend to do very well in all these different cultures. And maybe it's because they follow that advice. So I think it's something that we need to follow also. We need to understand that if we don't care about the welfare, if we don't care about, who's going to be leading the nation, and are they just moral people, do they have good convictions, good moral standing, then we're going to suffer as a consequence. So we're going to be responsible for that, especially in the form of government that we have today. We are supposedly a democratic nation, so we are supposed to influence,
So what would you tell people? Say, yeah, that's all fine and good, but this isn't our kingdom. We're citizens of heaven. We're only passing through. This is the world of the devil, the prince of the power of the air. He's the God of this world. We're not supposed to get involved in that stuff.
Well, the problem is that we're not in heaven yet. That's the problem. We're still praying, let thy kingdom come, let thy will be done. And so I believe that even that, let thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, we understand that that's speaking particularly or specifically about that time when Messiah will reign. But we are to work even as though Messiah was reigning, I believe. So we are working to get justice upon the earth, to get love and mercy and all these things into the earth. And so we do that as we become involved in all of these things.
Well, if there's a political thing going on in your town, do you speak from the pulpit about it, like a proposition, a new law, a new policy, a new procedure? Are you comfortable doing that?
If it was something that is going to really influence the congregation, the majority of things that are done locally are not that important usually. But yes, I think I should, and I think we would, because that's our responsibility to inform them about what does the Bible say about that. So we would give them principles about the subject matter, and then, of course, let them decide whatever they think.
Generally speaking, I agree with you. Local issues are not nearly as powerful as the federal ones that usually hit the big moral topics.
Yeah.
We're hitting something local right now that my people don't even know about yet. I just got an email about it very recently. In Phoenix and in Tucson, when the city council meets and the board of supervisors meet, they have usually in a minister to open with an invocation, a prayer. Mm-hmm. I've done it a few times myself over the years. Well, apparently Satanists in Phoenix wanted in on the act. Mm. And our country has gotten so stupid, so liberal, that, well, we do have freedom of religion, so who can say that no to that? Yeah. So sure enough, they have to have a Satanist opening up in prayer at the meeting. And now Tucson's saying that's going to happen in Tucson. So now we've got pastors in Tucson trying to do something to keep that from happening. Yeah. Muddle, what are your thoughts on believers getting involved in politics?
Just a quick story. I knew an old-time preacher many years ago who had an interesting habit. Whenever he'd preach from the Bible, he'd stand behind the podium, behind the pulpit. But he could not resist his temptation to speak out on politics. So he'd intentionally come out from behind the pulpit and kind of lean on it and said, now here's what I think.
I would think he'd want to hide behind the pulpit when he gave his opinion and be in front when he gave God's, but what do I know?
I think the verse that we were talking about, to do good unto all men, especially those with the household of faith, Lord has given us a certain number of years here as human beings, whether it be 80, 90, however many years, and I think we have to be engaged in doing good. If we're no earthly good, if we're only heavenly minded, then we may not be any earthly good. So I do believe that we should be engaged to a certain extent. However, it is foolishness to assume that by any fervent level of political involvement, we are going to turn the hearts of people from sin to righteousness. It's an old saw, it's said many times, because it's true. You can't legislate morality. Now, we can and we should have laws that recognize clearly the way the human race is set up. And that race is set up that you have a man and a woman who come together, and that is marriage. And so we can stand up for sanity and say that there is no such thing as homosexual marriage, just because the Supreme Court has temporarily okayed that. We're in a funny position. We're to obey the laws of the land, except to the extent where they contrast with the laws of God.
Right.
It is a slam in the face of God to say that a man can marry another man. It is not a gray area. It's a blatantly clear area. And so this would be an area where, as believers, there is no room for compromise. We don't have to be nasty. We don't have to call people involved in homosexuality by degrading names. There's no need for that. But for myself personally, if I was asked to attend a homosexual wedding, I could not and would not, no matter who it was, because I'm saying that I sanction the idea that these two men or two women are engaging in marriage. Marriage is ordained in the Scripture.
Right.
It's God's design. Now, on the other hand, I would be totally in favor of laws that protect people, no matter who they are, because of their general protection, but no special status, just because someone is involved in a certain particular lifestyle that the vast majority of people consider to be abhorrent. And so there is a fine balance that we have to strike here.
Yeah, because like when you said you can't legislate morality, well, that I think it implies personally. I mean, you can't put a law on an individual that does not know God, that does not love God. You know, a lady can have her husband be a drunk, and she can slam him over the head with, this thing, using the word of God, trying to, but he's not going to change. That's not going to change him. You know, Jesus Christ has got to come into his heart in order for him to accept that teaching or that reality of life. So we can't legislate morality, but yet every law that is established is always based on a moral judgment.
Yes, that's right.
So that's a fact. So again, who's going to be making the moral judgment? Is it going to be people that are atheists? Is it going to be Satanists like we're talking about? Or is it going to be a person or an individual that fears God or has some concept about who God is or what righteousness is as the Word of God describes it? And so again, that's where we need to have certain politics or certain individuals that are informed in those things and then would legislate according to that morality.
Let me ask you a really hard question. It's for both of you. And it's not just to stoke the fires and get an interesting conversation. I really want to hear your thoughts on it.
Sure.
Would you rather vote for some devout Christian politician, we'll say for president, who you're not sure if he would make a great leader, but he is a man of God, or somebody who you think would make a great leader but isn't a man of God?
Simple thing is, we're being asked right now in this current year, we're being asked to choose a president, not a pastor. And that needs to be kept in mind.
Yeah.
And so simply because a person is a devout individual who loves the Lord, I mean, we've had two or three different men just in this 2016 season who clearly love the Lord, who are devout individuals, but there's a real question about whether they have the leadership experience to lead the country. So that could be a real consideration. On the other hand, I think there are some people seeking the nomination who are both believers and do have the leadership ability. But in the end, the answer to the question is we're electing a pastor, not
a president.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Like you said before.
Thank you. Thank you. That was, it's my first mistake since my last mistake. We're electing a president of the United States, and that holds true for every nation. Other people may be viewing this around the world. We're not electing a pastor. The church is to have a different set of criteria than the nation, although certainly there could be some overlap in character. Certainly there should be. And that's why someone who has zero character, someone who is a person who abhorrently speaks evil of others on a regular basis, we would have pause and say this person probably is not the best person to represent our country.
Do you share Muddle's perspective in that we're going for a president, not a pastor, and just because somebody's a believer doesn't mean we should put that person into office?
Absolutely, that's without a doubt. You want a person who has the leadership quality, that has the character, that is, the foundation to be able to lead the nation. Obviously, we always think that if an individual fears God, that would be, in our estimation, a good thing. That would not be a bad thing. But again, we are choosing a leader that needs to make the right choices and lead the nation in the right way. And so, again, that would be the most important thing. Is he qualified for that position? And again, yes, we don't need a pastor. We just hope that he would be informed of the things of God, and he would fear, and he would make choices according to that. But again.
Okay. So now let me flip it around. That was the positive. Let's look at the negative. Somebody who plainly has political perspectives that are anti-God, pro-gay marriage. Let's do everything we can to promote that thing. Pro-homosexual is one thing. Pro-abortion is another thing. I can't think of any other issues that is morally on the forefront as those two.
Too big.
So let's just say the person is like, yeah, I'm a man of God. This person has great politics in their finances, their social justice. They've got great leadership skills. They're going to turn our country around. Do you have a problem with that?
I think the issue of the basic structure of our human race is one that looks at the reality that there's a man and a woman. And so to try to advocate for homosexual marriage, I think creates a real dysfunction.
I get that, but what if they say this? It's already an established fact. My candidate supports it, but it's irrelevant. Or abortion's already the law of the land. My candidate supports abortion, but it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant because it's already the law of the land. So I'm going to vote for this person. What do you think?
I think that I would have a problem with that again. And again, it's a matter of values. For example, someone says, well, like you're saying, well, abortion, I'm sorry, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
Well, I think the problem with us as believers is that we need to elevate certain things to a certain place, and other things need to be diminished under that. So what I tell people is this: if you have that concept and you say, well, what's important to you? What to me is that he's going to fill my pockets with money. He's really
Right,
going to
yeah.
make our nation prosperous, and I'm going to have the newest car. I'm going to have a 2-story house. And I say, when you get to heaven and God asks you, well, on one side, you could have chosen to undo abortion, or you could have chosen to have a house, a 2-story house and a real nice car. And you say, well, God, I chose a 2-story house and the new car. Do you really believe that that's going to be something that God is going to say, wow, you did wonderful, you did a good job? To me, it's a total misunderstanding about what the values
So even though that candidate may not be able to affect the outcome of the law, it's values.
Yes.
Well, ultimately, that person who becomes president will have a large part in deciding who the Supreme Court nominees are.
That's a key point that most people forget about.
And we have seen just in the last 10 years in our nation how putting people on the Supreme Court who have no regard for standard morality, that has wreaked havoc in our country, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
And so that's why having a president who will not try to legislate through a new, or try to force immorality on our nation, force these sorts of things, would be an important principle. And so, yes, there are things that are probably unmovable. Will Roe v. Wade be completely repealed? Probably not. But I don't think there's a person with warm blood who can understand what happens during partial birth abortion. This is the intentional abortion of a child who is almost ready to be born, who an ultrasound will show you that this child is a fully formed human being, that someone could believe that it is morally neutral to inject saline solution into the child, burn the child to death, and extricate the child from what should be the safest place on earth,
Yeah.
the womb of the mother. And so abortion, to me, tells about what we are as a nation. So much of Europe has fallen into immorality because of these things, and America very quickly followed. So yes, the moral positions of a candidate need to matter greatly. Not one that makes promises that they'll never keep, but one that looks at the situation and says, we as America should do better.
Here's a real terrifying thought. In ancient Israel, in biblical history, God would often take an evil nation and use them to discipline Israel, to judge Israel,
Yes.
because Israel needed to be judged. And Israel at times would say, they're worse than we are. But obviously that wasn't God's perspective. So here we are, free country, prosperous country. We're a country that supports all other countries. Our economy props up the world. We're a good country. We kill tens of millions of babies. We've told God that his order of creation for man and woman is worthless, and we've thrown it under the bus. And now we're seeing Islamic State taking over much of the world. They're doing horrible things. They're beheading people, and they're torturing Christians and Jews. But what's worse, killing babies or killing mature men and women? We kill tens of millions, they kill a few hundred. Do I like what they're doing and think they're good and righteous? No, they're evil, wicked people. But what about us? And is it conceivable that they might be the instrument of our judgment?
You know, it's terrifying, and I'm glad you prefaced it that way, but there's a real caution when you try to take principles, theocratic principles, from the nation of Israel, which had a covenant relationship with God, and try to transfer them to the United States, which is not a theocratic nation. We are not in contract relationship with God. There are books recently, popular books in the Christian market, that have attempted to do this. And I think that is an error. It's a theologically flawed thing, because Israel was in theological marriage with God. Jehovah is the wife of Israel. Israel, as the Jewish prophets say, committed adultery. And a bill of divorcement was written. It was never given, it was never enacted, but in a dramatic way, a bill of divorcement was written out and displayed. God has not acted on it because he has an earlier covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, that also defines his relationship with Israel. So it's a dangerous thing to try to take this Old Testament principle and imagine that it's going to be applied in a concrete way. Now, I understand God never changes. His character is unchanged. Might he choose to do this? Might he choose to discipline America through any variety of means? Absolutely. And in many ways, the privilege that America had over many years is now being withdrawn. There are movements to take the dollar off as the world currency standard. America's lost prestige in so many areas. So in some ways, we are already experiencing the result of our wallowing in the mud. But as tempting as it is to apply that historical lesson, it's a real theological yellow flag. Because once you take that, and then it's only your imagination limits what you will then do.
So you're not saying that that's impossible or even unlikely. You're saying there's no theological basis for the necessity.
Exactly. Believers today have an individual relationship with the Lord. Israel was in corporate relationship to the Lord through the Mosaic covenant. Believers today are in individual relationship to the Lord because of our adoption as sons and daughters. that is a different legal status. Nevertheless, there is a basic scriptural principle. Sin has consequences. And our country is experiencing the consequences of national sin. In so many spheres of our national endeavor, we've experienced the diminishing of America because we have lowered the standards.
Right is wrong, up is down, left is right.
Someone changed the price tags, is the phrase that we sometimes use.
But again, God does judge nations. You know, we're reading right now out of the book of Isaiah in our studies in the morning, and it's very telling that God is speaking to nations. God is bringing judgment upon them according to what they do, and a lot of times what they do against Israel. But God is involved in the nations, and so there are certain principles that are at work in nations, maybe for the reason that Mondale speaks about. But you know, God does work in the nations also. He has given them a time, a limit, a place, the Bible says. And so I think we do need to seek the favor of God as a nation. And so as we do righteousness in nations, and if we do what is right in a nation, God will bless the nation. And if we do what is unrighteous, then God will not bless that nation.
We as believers, I'm reminded of that passage where it says that Lot, living in Sodom, his righteous soul was vexed day after day by witnessing the lifestyle, the evil that surrounded him. That's how I see believers today in the United States. Their righteous souls are vexed. We can't get together as a group of believers without kvetching about what's going on in our country today. And it's not that we're just angry, though it's righteous indignation for sure, but we're so offended and so hurt and so saddened by the state of affairs in our country. A lot of people think that maybe the next candidate can get us out.
Yeah, there's always that hope.
And then there's a lot of people say, Steve, we don't put our faith in candidates, we put our faith in God. I say, of course, but God uses leaders, human leaders, to effect his will on earth also, for better or for ill from our human perspective.
That's right, yeah.
I think the church needs to be, in a certain sense, also the conscience of the world. In a certain sense, I think I read somewhere that Hitler hated the Jews because they had inflicted certain things upon the human race, and among them was conscience.
Yeah.
Wow, where did you know where you got that from?
Yeah.
That's out of his book.
Yeah,
His book. What was it called?
There's a big psychological thing that goes around saying, and you know, this is a little off topic, but why was one of the motivations for Hitler hating the Jews? It's because Hitler rebelled against all religion. He was born into a Protestant home, raised in the Catholic school. He hated all religion, and ultimately when he found out that it was Judaism that gave the world Jesus and Christianity, that a lot of people, German psychologists have said, his ultimate anger and his rage was that this is the people, as Umberto said, who introduced the concept of a morality, that there was a moral standard that you were accountable to. It was, part of it was the Jewish influence on the world.
Wow.
And
It's an important concept.
And so he saw that as an evil thing. You know, he
Right,
saw that as a
yeah.
bad thing.
Yeah.
And again, to me, it's a good thing. And so we living in the nations need to be that conscience, because if we as believers don't have that conscience, how is the world going to have that conscience? So again, I think in our voting and all these things that we're doing, we need to try to uphold a conscience about abortion and about all of these things. If we don't do it, then who's going to be doing it?
Well, this isn't the place, nor do we have the time to analyze this thing I'm going to raise right now. But a lot of people think, it says when the restrainer is removed, the lawless will abound. A lot of people think that's the Holy Spirit manifested within the body of Messiah. The rapture will take them all out, all the goodness will be removed from the world, and then chaos will descend. Again, it's a topic to be discussed. Unfortunately, we don't have time for it. We've been talking this episode, or this part of the episode, about politics and believers. And I think we have a consensus that it's good and wholesome to be involved, to be concerned, to be active, to support candidates that are godly, whether they're godly themselves or not. That is, that they support godly principles.
Yes.
And to stay away from the candidates that don't. We don't believe it's necessary that a candidate has to be a believer for us to endorse that candidate. But if they're contrary to God, we should definitely not be supportive of that candidate. Is that pretty much where we're at?
Yes, yes.
All right. Well, you've been watching The Shepherd's Heart. Steve Shermett, Maro Ballaston, Humberto Porras. We're almost a joke. A pastor and a rabbi walk into a studio. We'll see you next time on The Shepherd's Heart.
This program was produced by and for God's Learning Channel. If you enjoyed this program, we need your support to help keep this program on GLC. Please make your checks out to God's Learning Channel, P.O. Box 61000, Midland, Texas 79711-1000. Please be sure to designate where your contribution is intended. It is very important to let GLC know which programs you enjoy and support.
Order your copy of this program from the GLC bookstore by calling the numbers or visiting the website on your screen. Please include the program number when ordering.